The snow fell in thick curtains across the Yorkshire countryside as December arrived at Ashwood Orphanage. Inside its cold stone walls, 12-year-old Thomas Ashford pressed his face against the frosted window, watching the road for the carriage that always came on the first Sunday of winter. Every year, for as long as he could remember, the Duke of Ashwood made his visit, bringing coal for the fires, blankets for the beds, and coins for the orphanage coffers. And every year Thomas watched him with an ache he could not name, a longing that settled deep in his small chest like a stone. Beside him the other children whispered excitedly, "The Duke is coming! The Duke is coming!" Their voices carried hope and hunger in equal measure. For most, the Duke's visit meant an extra portion at supper, perhaps a warm coat if they were lucky. But for Thomas, it meant something else entirely, something he could never speak aloud. When the black carriage finally appeared through the swirling snow, Thomas's heart began to pound. He smoothed his worn shirt and straightened his thin shoulders, though he knew the Duke would likely never notice him among the 30 orphans who crowded the entrance hall. He was just another nameless child, another forgotten soul. The Duke of Ashwood, Lord Julian Ashwood, stepped through the heavy oak doors like winter itself made flesh. Tall and commanding at 45 years, his dark hair silvered at the temples, his grey eyes sharp as steel, he wore his wealth and title like armour, every inch the nobleman whose family had ruled these lands for 300 years. Yet there was something in his face, a sadness that lurked behind his formal courtesy, a shadow that never quite lifted. "Good day, children," he said, his voice deep and measured. "I trust you are well cared for in this season." A chorus of "Yes, Your Graces" rose from the assembled orphans. Mrs. Grimley, the orphanage matron, curtsied deeply, her keys jingling at her waist. "Your Grace honours us with your presence. As always, we are most grateful for your continued generosity." The Duke inclined his head stiffly. "It is my duty to the estate and its people, no more, no less." Yet as his gaze swept the room, it lingered briefly on Thomas. Just a moment, perhaps less than a breath, but Thomas felt it like a brand upon his skin. Those grey eyes, so like his own, met his across the crowd. Then the Duke looked away, and the moment shattered. The visit proceeded as it always did. The Duke inspected the dormitories, the kitchen, the small schoolroom where Mr. Pemberton taught letters and numbers to those children deemed capable of learning. He listened to Mrs. Grimley's reports of repairs needed and supplies running low. He spoke briefly with a few of the older boys about apprenticeships in the village. His manner was correct, generous even, but distant. Always distant. Thomas followed at the edges of the group, staying close enough to hear the Duke's voice, but far enough to remain invisible. He studied every detail. The way the Duke's hands moved when he spoke, the slight furrow between his brows when something displeased him, the particular way he stood, weight shifted to his left side, as if an old injury still troubled him. "You there, boy?" The Duke's voice cut through Thomas's observation like a knife. Thomas, startled, realizing with horror that those grey eyes had fixed upon him once more. "Yes, Your Grace," he whispered, his throat suddenly dry. "What is your name?" "Thomas Ashford, sir." "I mean Your Grace." The Duke's expression did not change, yet something flickered across his features. Too quick to read, too subtle to name. "Ashford, an uncommon name for one in your circumstances. How came you by it?" Thomas felt the weight of every eye in the room upon him. "I was found at Your Grace's estate gates, 12 years past. The steward who brought me here said I should carry the name of the land that birthed me, though, in truth, he did not know if this was true or merely a story he had told himself. So many times it had become true in the telling. The Duke studied him with unsettling intensity. "You were found at Ashwood's gates." "Yes, "Your Grace, in winter, during a storm. They said I was but newly born, wrapped in cloth, too fine for common folk, but no one ever claimed me." A long silence stretched between them. The other children shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Grimley cleared her throat, preparing to intervene, but the Duke raised one hand slightly, forestalling her. "You have the look of—" The Duke paused, as if the words had caught somewhere between thought and speech. "You are being educated, I trust." "Yes, Your Grace," Thomas answered quickly. "Mr. Pemberton says I have an aptitude for learning. I read well and cipher better." "Good," the Duke said, his voice oddly tight. "That is good." He turned abruptly away, addressing Mrs. Grimley with renewed formality. "See that this boy receives additional instruction if he shows promise. I shall provide funds for books and materials." With that pronouncement, the Duke swept from the orphanage as suddenly as he had arrived, leaving behind a flurry of whispered speculation and Thomas standing frozen by the window, watching the black carriage disappear once more into the snow. That night, unable to sleep, Thomas crept from his narrow bed and made his way to the small library where the orphanage kept its meager collection of books. Among them was a volume he had discovered years ago, hidden behind more practical texts, a history of the Ashwood family, its pages yellowed and spine cracked from age. By candlelight, Thomas studied the illustrations of past dukes and duchesses. He traced the family tree with one finger, noting the names and dates, and there, in the most recent entry, he found what he always sought and dreaded in equal measure. Julian Ashwood, 9th Duke of Ashwood, born 1775, married 1808 to Lady Catherine Morland. No children. The words "no children" seemed to burn on the page. Thomas knew them by heart, yet each time he read them, they struck fresh. The Duke had been married for 12 years. 12 years, the same span of Thomas's life, and his wife, Lady Catherine, had died 4 years past in circumstances the book did not detail. Thomas closed the volume carefully and extinguished his candle. In the darkness, he allowed himself a dangerous thought, a thought he permitted only in the deepest night when no one could see his face or read his heart. What if the cloth that had wrapped him as an infant truly was too fine for common folk? What if someone had loved him enough to bring him to those gates on a winter's night, rather than leave him to die in the storm? What if the Duke's lingering gaze held recognition he dared not speak? But morning always came, bringing with it the harsh light of reality. Thomas Ashford was an orphan, nothing more, and the Duke of Ashwood was a great lord who visited once each winter out of duty, not affection. To imagine otherwise was to court a heartbreak more bitter than the Yorkshire cold. The years turned like pages in a book, each winter bringing the Duke's visit and Thomas's silent observation. At 13, Thomas had grown tall and lean, his dark hair unruly, despite all efforts to tame it. At 14, he won a scholarship to continue his education, a rare gift arranged through funds the Duke had quietly provided. At 15, he began assisting Mr. Pemberton in teaching the younger children, discovering a gift for patience and clarity that surprised them both. And each December, when snow fell thick and the Duke's carriage arrived, Thomas watched. He watched the way sadness deepened in those grey eyes year by year. He watched the Duke's shoulders grow more burdened, despite the wealth and power that surrounded him. He watched and wondered, and hoped for something he could never name. The winter Thomas turned 16 changed everything. The snow that year came early and stayed late, blanketing the countryside in white silence. When the Duke's carriage appeared on its appointed day, Thomas had been helping repair the roof over the girls' dormitory. He descended the ladder with frozen fingers and snow-dusted hair, arriving in the entrance hall just as the Duke removed his greatcoat. Their eyes met across the crowded space, and something passed between them. A jolt of recognition, perhaps, or merely the shared acknowledgement of familiar strangers who had enacted this ritual for 16 years. Thomas could not tell, but he saw the Duke's hand pause mid-motion, saw his gaze sharpen and focus with new intensity. "Thomas Ashford," the Duke said, and it was not a question. "Your Grace remembers me. I am honored." "How could I forget?" the Duke replied, his voice carrying an odd inflection. "You have grown considerable since our first meeting. Mr. Pemberton speaks highly of your progress." Thomas felt heat rise to his face. "Mr. Pemberton is generous in his assessment, Your Grace. I merely try to prove worthy of the opportunities provided." The Duke moved closer, closing the distance between them with slow, deliberate steps. The crowd of children and staff seemed to fade, leaving only the two of them in a bubble of strange intimacy. "You have a look about you," the Duke said quietly. His voice had dropped low enough that only Thomas could hear. "A bearing that suggests breeding beyond your circumstances." Thomas's heart hammered against his ribs. "I am an orphan, Your Grace. Whatever I am comes from the kindness of this place and the mercy of its patron." "Mercy," the Duke repeated, as if tasting the word and finding it bitter. "Is that what you think this is?" Thomas did not know how to answer. The Duke's gaze raked over his face with an intensity that made him want to look away, yet he found himself unable to break that connection. "Come with me," the Duke said suddenly. "I would speak with you privately." Fear and hope warred in Thomas's chest as he followed the Duke to the small parlour where Mrs. Grimley normally received visitors. The Duke closed the door behind them, and for a long moment said nothing. He merely stood at the window, looking out at the snow-covered grounds with his hands clasped behind his back. "Do you know why I visit this orphanage each winter, Thomas?" the Duke asked at last. "Because Your Grace is a good and beautiful man who cares for those less fortunate," Thomas replied carefully. A bitter laugh escaped the Duke's throat. "Duty. Yes, I suppose that is what I tell myself." He turned from the window, and the expression on his face struck Thomas like a physical blow. It was anguish, raw and unguarded. "For 16 years I have come here," the Duke continued. "For 16 years I have seen you grow, from infant to boy to young man. And for 16 years I have been too much a coward to speak the truth." Thomas felt the floor seem to tilt beneath him. "Your Grace, what truth?" The Duke removed something from his pocket. A small object that caught the weak winter light. He held it out to Thomas. A silver locket, tarnished with age. "Take it," the Duke said hoarsely. "Open it." With shaking fingers, Thomas obeyed. Inside the locket were 2 miniature portraits. On one side, a young woman with fair hair and a gentle smile. On the other, an infant wrapped in an embroidered christening gown. The cloth was unmistakably fine, too fine for common folk. "My wife, Lady Catherine," the Duke said softly, "and our son, born in secret and shame 16 years ago this very night." Thomas stared at the portraits, his mind refusing to accept what his heart already knew. "But the book," he whispered. "It said no children. It said you had no heir." The Duke's face twisted with pain. "My wife was not strong. The doctors warned that bearing a child would likely kill her. When she discovered herself with child, we kept it secret, hoping against hope. She was determined to give me an heir, even if it cost her life." His voice broke, and it nearly did. Thomas could not breathe, could not think. The Duke continued, his words tumbling out as if a dam had broken after years of holding back a flood. "She survived the birth, but barely. She was so weak, so very weak. And the child, you were premature. small and fragile. The doctors said you would not live the night, that we should prepare ourselves for loss. So you gave me away, Thomas heard himself say. The words came from somewhere distant, as if spoken by a stranger, to spare yourselves the grief of watching me die. No, the Duke said fiercely, stepping forward. No, that is not. He stopped, struggling for words. Catherine begged me. She was delirious with fever and grief. She said she could not bear to watch you die, that it would destroy her utterly if she held you and felt your life slip away. She made me promise to take you somewhere warm, somewhere safe, somewhere you would be cared for if, God willing, you survived. I swear to you, Thomas, I meant to return. I brought you to the gates wrapped in your christening gown, with a note explaining that you were noble-born and should be treated with care. I left coins enough for your upbringing. I rang the bell and hid in the trees to make sure you were found. And I vowed I would return in 3 days to claim you and bring you home if you lived. But you did not, Thomas said flatly. No. The Duke's shoulders sagged. I did not. Catherine's fever worsened. By the 2nd day, she did not know me. By the 3rd, she was unconscious. The doctors said if I left her side, she would die alone. And I, God forgive me, I chose her. She lived, the Duke continued, his voice hollow, against all expectation. She survived. But when I finally returned to the orphanage a week later, I learned that the note had been lost, that you had been registered simply as a foundling, that no one knew who you truly were. And still you did not claim me, Thomas said. 16 years, and you never spoke. Why? The Duke's face was ashen. Because I am a coward. Because Catherine, when she recovered, could not bear to speak of you. The guilt and grief had broken something in her mind. She convinced herself the child had died, that you were a dream, or a phantom. If I brought you home, the doctors feared it would shatter her entirely. So I told myself I was protecting her, that I was being merciful, that visiting you here, providing for you from a distance, was enough. I told myself so many lies, Thomas, so many lies to quiet my conscience. Thomas felt tears burning behind his eyes, but he would not let them fall. And when she died 4 years ago, why did you not claim me then? The Duke's voice dropped to a whisper. Because by then you were 12 years old. You had a life, friends, a place in this world. What right did I have to tear you from everything you knew, to thrust you into a life of nobility you were never prepared for? I told myself you were better off here, that disturbing your peace would be cruelty, not kindness. More lies, more cowardice. Thomas looked down at the locket, still clutched in his palm. The infant's face gazed up at him, innocent and unknowing. You have grey eyes, he said suddenly, like mine, like my mother's. The Duke replied, like yours, like he paused, like your grandfather's and your great-grandfather's before him. The eyes of the Ashwood line. The silence that followed was vast and terrible. Outside, children's voices rose in song, practicing carols for the Christmas service. The sound seemed to come from another world entirely. What happens now? Thomas asked finally. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, calm and level, as if they were discussing the weather, rather than the destruction and rebuilding of his entire existence. The Duke straightened, and Thomas saw him gather the armor of his title and station around himself once more. That depends upon you, he said formally. I have no right to ask anything of you, no right to call you son after abandoning you for 16 years. If you wish to remain here, I will continue to provide for you from a distance as I always have. If you wish to seek your fortune elsewhere, I will arrange an apprenticeship or a post in any profession you choose. He paused, and his voice cracked. "Or, if you can find it in your heart to forgive an old fool his cowardice and lies, you may come home to Ashwood Manor as my acknowledged son and heir." Thomas felt the weight of the choice pressing down upon him. His entire life had been spent watching the Duke from a distance, wondering, hoping, dreaming of impossible things. And now the impossible stood before him, offered in the shaking hands of a man who looked suddenly ancient despite his years. "I do not know if I can forgive you," Thomas said slowly. Honestly, the Duke's face crumpled, but Thomas continued, "But I would like the chance to try. I would like to know the man who is my father, not the distant Duke who visits once a year. I would like to understand the choices you made and why you made them. And perhaps, in understanding, forgiveness will follow." The Duke closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them, tears glistened in the grey depths. "You are wiser than I ever was at your age," he said hoarsely. "Wiser than I am even now. Thank you, Thomas. Thank you." There was no embrace, no sudden rush of paternal affection. They stood on opposite sides of the room, two strangers bound by blood, but separated by years of silence and secrets. Yet it was a beginning, the first honest beginning they had ever had. The days that followed moved with dreamlike strangeness. Mrs. Grimley was informed of Thomas's true identity, her shock quickly covered by a flurry of arrangements and preparations. The other children looked at Thomas with new eyes, some with envy, others with a sadness he understood too well. He was leaving them behind, crossing an invisible line that divided the forgotten from the claimed. On the morning of his departure, Thomas stood once more at the frosted window, looking out at the snow-covered grounds. But this time he would be the one leaving, the one riding away in the black carriage while others watched from behind cold glass. Mr. Pemberton found him there, the old teacher's eyes red-rimmed behind his spectacles. "I always suspected there was something different about you, lad," he said quietly. "The way the Duke looked at you, the special attention he paid to your education. I convinced myself I was imagining things, that I was a foolish old man seeing patterns where none existed." "You were not wrong," Thomas replied. "But you never said anything. What good would it have done?" Pemberton asked gently. "Sometimes silence is its own kind of protection. But I am glad the truth has come to light at last. You deserve to know who you are, Thomas. You always did. I am still the same person I was yesterday." Thomas said, "Still the orphan who lived in this place for 16 years. Pemberton smiled sadly. "No, my boy. Yesterday you were an orphan. Today you are the Duke's son. The world will see you differently now, whether you feel different or not. Remember where you came from, but do not let it chain you to the past. You have been given a rare gift, a second chance at the life you should have had from birth. Do not waste it." The carriage ride to Ashwood Manor passed in silence. Thomas sat across from the Duke, watching the countryside roll past through the window. They had not yet learned how to speak to each other as father and son. Perhaps they never would, but the Duke had given him the locket, and Thomas clutched it now like a talisman, feeling the cool silver warm against his palm. When Ashwood Manor finally came into view, Thomas's breath caught in his throat. He had imagined it countless times, but reality surpassed every dream. The great house rose from the snow-covered grounds, like a palace from a fairy story, its golden stone glowing in the weak winter sunlight. Towers and turrets reached toward the grey sky. Windows sparkled like jewels. It was magnificent, and it was, impossibly, his home. The Duke watched Thomas's reaction with an expression that might have been hope or might have been fear. "What do you think?" he asked quietly. Thomas could not find words large enough to contain what he felt. "It is beyond anything I imagined, Your Grace," he whispered finally. The Duke flinched slightly. You need not call me your grace any more, Thomas. I am your father. Though I have not earned the right to that title, it is yours to use if you wish. Thomas met his eyes. Then, what shall I call you? The Duke was silent for a long moment. My name is Julian, he said at last. Perhaps we might start there, with names and truth, and build the rest as we go. The staff of Ashwood Manor had been prepared for Thomas's arrival, though their expressions betrayed their shock and speculation. A sudden heir appearing after 16 years, it was the stuff of gossip and scandal, of rumours that would spread through the county like wildfire. But the Duke, Julian, faced them all with steely dignity. "This is my son, Thomas," he announced to the assembled household. "He will be addressed as Lord Thomas Ashford, and treated with all the respect due to the heir of this house. Anyone who questions his legitimacy or spreads malicious gossip will be dismissed immediately without reference. Is that understood?" A chorus of "Yes, your graces" rose from the staff. Thomas felt their eyes upon him, assessing, judging, measuring. He straightened his shoulders and lifted his chin, calling upon every lesson in dignity he had learned from watching his father from a distance all these years. The days that followed were a whirlwind of new experiences. Thomas was fitted for new clothes, the rough orphanage garments replaced by fine wool and linen. He was given a suite of rooms in the East Wing, with a view of the grounds that seemed to stretch forever. He was introduced to the estate steward, the butler, the housekeeper, and countless others whose names and functions blurred together in an overwhelming tide. But the hardest part was learning to be a son. Julian tried. Thomas could see him trying, but years of distance and formality stood between them like a wall. Neither knew how to breach. They took meals together in uncomfortable silence. They walked the grounds with careful space maintained between them. They discussed estate matters and Thomas's education with the stiff politeness of strangers. It was not until Christmas Eve that something finally shifted. Thomas had been given permission to invite the children from the orphanage to celebrate the holiday at Ashwood Manor. It was his one condition for accepting his new life, that he not forget those he was leaving behind, that he use his position to bring them some small measure of joy. Julian had agreed immediately, and Thomas suspected it was partly from guilt and partly from genuine desire to do right by the children he had been supporting from a distance for so many years. The manor was decorated with holly and ivy. A great tree stood in the entrance hall, blazing with candles. Tables groaned under the weight of food the orphans would likely never taste again. When the children arrived, their eyes wide with wonder, Thomas felt something in his chest crack open. He showed them the house, the grounds, the stables where sleek horses lived better than most people. He watched them devour cakes and puddings with the desperation of those who never knew when the next meal might come. And he saw Julian watching too, his expression unguarded for once, full of sorrow and recognition. That night, after the children had been bundled back into carriages and sent home with full bellies and small gifts, Thomas found Julian in the library. His father sat before the fire, staring into the flames, with a glass of brandy untouched beside him. "Thank you," Thomas said, breaking the silence, "for allowing me to do this." Julian looked up, and Thomas was startled to see tears tracking down his weathered face. "No," he said hoarsely, "thank you for reminding me what truly matters, for showing me what I should have seen 16 years ago. That duty and honor mean nothing if they are not tempered with compassion and love." He rose unsteadily and approached Thomas. "For 16 years I told myself I was doing the right thing, the honorable thing. Protecting my wife, protecting you. But tonight, watching those children, I saw myself clearly for the first time. I was not protecting anyone. I was protecting my own comfort, my own fear. And I robbed you of 16 years you can never have back." His voice broke completely. "I cannot undo what I have done, Thomas. I cannot give you back your childhood or erase the pain of growing up unwanted and unnamed. But I swear to you on my life and title and honor, I will spend every day I have left trying to be the father I should have been from the beginning." Thomas felt his own tears rising, hot and unstoppable. He had spent weeks holding them back, refusing to let them fall, but now they came in a flood. "I do not need grand promises," he said thickly. "I just need to know that you wanted me, that I was not a burden or a shame, that somewhere in your heart you loved me even when you could not claim me." Julian closed the distance between them and for the first time pulled Thomas into an embrace. The boy who had watched dukes from orphanage windows allowed himself to be held by the father he had only dreamed of knowing, and in that moment, surrounded by the warmth of firelight and the scent of pine boughs, Thomas felt something settle into place. Not forgiveness, perhaps, not yet, but the beginning of healing, the first tender shoots of trust. "I loved you," Julian whispered against Thomas's hair. "From the moment I saw you draw breath, I loved you, and that love has haunted me every single day. Every visit to that orphanage was both penance and blessing, a chance to see you, to assure myself you lived and thrived, even if I could never acknowledge you as my own." "Why did you never tell me sooner?" Thomas asked, his voice muffled against his father's shoulder. "If you loved me, why let me believe I was unwanted for so long?" Julian pulled back, holding Thomas at arm's length so he could look into his face. "Because I am a fool," he said simply. "Because I convinced myself that ignorance was mercy, that if you did not know what you were missing, you could not mourn the loss. I told myself I was sparing you pain, when in truth I was only sparing myself the pain of seeing what my choices had cost you." He shook his head, fresh tears spilling down his weathered cheeks. "Every year I came to that orphanage, I planned to tell you. Every year I rehearsed the words, imagined your reaction, prepared myself for your anger or your joy. But every year when I saw you standing there, so brave and self-contained, I lost my courage. What if you hated me? What if you refused to believe me? What if I destroyed the careful peace you had built for yourself in that place?" Thomas understood then, with a clarity that came from his own experience of survival, that courage takes many forms, that sometimes the most broken people are those who appear strongest, that his father had been carrying his own weight of abandonment and loss all these years, just as Thomas had been carrying his. "I do not hate you," Thomas said quietly. "I am angry, yes, and hurt, but I do not hate you. You gave me life twice, once when I was born and again when you made sure I survived that first winter. You could have left me to die in the storm. You could have forgotten about me entirely once you brought me to the orphanage, but you did not. You came back every year. You watched over me from a distance. That has to count for something." Julian's face crumpled with relief and grief. "You are more generous than I deserve." "No," Thomas corrected gently. "I am simply choosing to see the whole truth, not just the parts that hurt. You made mistakes, terrible mistakes born of fear and pain and impossible choices, but you also made sacrifices. You provided for me. You ensured I was educated. You gave me opportunities other orphans never received. That was love, even if it was imperfect, even if it was not enough." The fire crackled in the hearth, sending shadows dancing across the book-lined walls. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, soft and silent, blanketing the world in white forgiveness. "We cannot change the past," Thomas continued, "but we can choose how we move forward. You asked if I could forgive you, and I said I did not know. I still do not know if forgiveness is something I can give right now, but I can give you this. I can give you the chance to be my father, truly my father, from this day forward. We can build something new together, something neither of us has had before. Julian gripped Thomas's shoulders with trembling hands. What have I done to deserve such grace from you? Perhaps, Thomas said with a small smile. You passed it to me in blood and bone. Perhaps it is one of the things I inherited from the Ashwood line, along with these grey eyes and this stubborn chin. A surprised laugh burst from Julian's throat, broken and wet, but genuine. The sound of it warmed Thomas more than the fire ever could. Yes, he agreed, wiping at his eyes with the back of his hand. Yes, you have my mother's stubbornness, and her capacity for mercy as well. She would have liked you, Thomas. She would have been so proud of the man you have become, despite everything I did to hinder your path. Tell me about her, Thomas requested, settling into the chair opposite his father. Tell me about my mother. Not the Duchess, but the woman. What she loved. What made her laugh. What dreams she held before illness and loss took them away. And so Julian began to speak, his voice gaining strength as he unwound the story of Lady Catherine. A gentle woman who loved music and poetry, who walked the gardens at dawn to watch the flowers open, who had a gift for seeing beauty in small things that others overlooked, who had wanted nothing more than to be a mother, and whose body's betrayal in that one fundamental desire had broken something deep inside her. As Julian spoke, Thomas felt the missing pieces of himself slot into place. He was not just an orphan or an heir. He was the son of two people who had loved him in the only ways they knew how, imperfectly, incompletely, but with a fierce desperation that had shaped every choice they made, for better or worse. The clock struck midnight, and Christmas had arrived. The sacred day when, according to faith and tradition, the world was given a gift it did not deserve, but desperately needed. A chance at redemption. A possibility of grace. Thomas looked at his father. This man who had been both blessing and burden, both presence and absence in his life, and he made a choice. I would like to visit Mother's grave tomorrow, he said. If you will show me where she rests. Julian's eyes widened with surprise and hope. You would honor her memory, even after everything. She gave me life, Thomas replied simply. And from what you tell me, she loved me in the only way her broken heart could manage. That deserves recognition, deserves gratitude. She may not have been able to keep me, but she did not abandon me to death. She chose survival for me even when it cost her everything. That is a mother's love, is it not, to sacrifice your own peace for your child's life? Julian could not speak. He simply nodded, overcome, and Thomas saw in that moment the full weight of 16 years of guilt lift slightly from his father's shoulders. Not gone entirely, perhaps never gone entirely, but lightened, made bearable by the unexpected mercy of a son who had every right to bitterness but chose understanding instead. Christmas morning dawned, clear and cold. Thomas, dressed in his fine new clothes, still strange against his skin after a lifetime of rough orphanage wool. He met Julian in the entrance hall, and together they walked through snow-drifted grounds to the family chapel. Inside, in a quiet corner lit by coloured light from stained glass windows, they found Lady Catherine's tomb. The marble effigy showed a young woman in repose, her hands folded peacefully across her chest. Someone had left fresh flowers despite the season, and Thomas suspected his father made this pilgrimage more often than he admitted. Julian stood silent beside the tomb, his weathered hand resting lightly on the cold stone. "Catherine," he said softly, "our son has come home. Our Thomas, he lives and thrives, just as you prayed he would. You would be so proud of him, my dear. So very proud." Thomas approached the tomb slowly, reverently. He had never known this woman, would never hear her voice or feel her embrace, but he could honor her memory, could acknowledge the debt he owed her for the gift of life, however complicated that gift had been. "Thank you," he said simply, placing his hand beside his father's on the marble, "for wanting me to live, for loving me enough to let me go. I hope you have found peace now, Mother. I hope you know that your sacrifice was not in vain." They stood together in the quiet chapel, father and son, united finally in grief and gratitude. The light through the stained glass painted them in shades of blue and gold, and Thomas felt something settle deep in his soul, a sense of belonging he had never quite managed to grasp in all his years at the orphanage. He had been found, not at the gates 16 years ago, but here, now, in this moment of shared vulnerability and hard-won honesty. The year that followed brought challenges neither Thomas nor Julian had anticipated. Society buzzed with speculation about the Duke's sudden heir. Some questioned Thomas's legitimacy, despite Julian's fierce insistence on the truth. Others whispered about scandal and secrets, about what must have happened for a child to be hidden for 16 years. There were snubs at social gatherings, raised eyebrows at balls, doors that closed politely but firmly against the young man with the questionable past. But Thomas faced it all with the dignity he had learned from watching his father from a distance, and the resilience he had earned through years of being overlooked and forgotten. He studied estate management with the steward, learned the intricacies of land law and tenant relations, practiced the subtle art of negotiation and leadership. He was determined to prove himself worthy of the Ashwood name, not because he needed society's approval, but because he needed his own. Julian watched his son's transformation with a mixture of pride and sorrow. Pride in Thomas's strength and character. Sorrow for the childhood that had been stolen and could never be restored. They grew closer slowly, carefully, learning each other's habits and preferences, learning to read unspoken emotions and offer comfort without words. It was not the relationship they might have had if Thomas had been raised at Ashwood from birth. Too much had been lost. Too many years could not be recovered. But it was real. It was honest. And in its own imperfect way, it was enough. The following winter, as December approached once more, Thomas made a request. "I wish to visit the orphanage again," he told Julian. "I wish to continue your tradition of a Christmas visit." Our tradition now. Julian studied his son's face, seeing echoes of himself and Catherine in every line. "You would do this? Even after everything that place represents, because of everything it represents," Thomas corrected. "That orphanage gave me shelter when I had none, education when I might have had none, a chance to survive and grow when I might have perished. I will not forget that. I will not abandon those who still wait behind those cold windows for someone to see them." Julian's eyes glistened with tears. He no longer tried to hide. "Then we shall go together," he said, "father and son." Continuing a tradition of care, but building it anew with honesty and purpose. On the first Sunday of December, 2 carriages arrived at Ashwood Orphanage instead of one. The children pressed their faces to the frosted windows, watching as the Duke of Ashwood descended from the first carriage. But their excited whispers turned to amazed murmurs when a second figure emerged from the second carriage. Thomas Ashford, the orphan who had been claimed, the boy who had left them behind to become a lord. Thomas walked through those familiar doors with his head high and his heart full. Mrs. Grimley curtsied, Mr. Pemberton bowed, and the children stared with wide eyes. But Thomas did not see judgment or envy in their faces. He saw hope. He saw the possibility that if one orphan could be claimed, perhaps others might be as well. That if one forgotten child could find a family, perhaps they all might someday. "Good day, children," Julian said, his voice carrying that familiar formal courtesy. But then he paused, and something new entered his tone. Something warm and genuine that had not been there in years past. "My son and I are honored to spend this day with you. You are each precious and valued, not for what you might become, but for who you are now." Thomas stepped forward, and for the first time in all his visits to this place, he spoke, not as a lord or an heir, but as one of them, someone who understood. "I know what it is to wonder if anyone sees you," he said quietly, "to feel invisible, to watch others claim children while you remain unclaimed. I know the weight of that particular loneliness, but I am here to tell you that being forgotten does not mean you are worthless. Being overlooked does not mean you are unlovable. Each of you has value beyond measure. Each of you deserves to be seen and known and cherished." He glanced at Julian, and his father nodded encouragement. "Some of you will be fortunate enough to find families who claim you, others may not. But I promise you this, as long as I have breath and means, you will be provided for. You will have opportunity. You will have someone who remembers you and works for your welfare. You will not be truly alone." A small girl in the front, no more than 7, raised her hand tentatively. "Yes?" Thomas acknowledged her gently. "If you was forgotten," she asked in a tiny voice, "how come you got remembered?" Thomas knelt down so he could look her in the eye. "Because someone loved me," he said simply, "even when they could not show it in ways I understood, even when years and fear and difficult choices stood between us. That love waited. It endured. And when the time was finally right, it brought me home." He looked around at all the children, these small souls who carried burdens too heavy for their young shoulders. "Love is patient," he told them. "Love is stubborn. Love does not always look the way we think it should, but it is worth waiting for, worth hoping for, worth believing in, even when belief seems impossible." The visit that day was different from all that had come before. Julian and Thomas walked the orphanage halls together, asking questions, learning names, making note of needs and dreams. They spoke with the older boys about apprenticeships and the younger children about education. They promised improvements to the building, better food, more blankets, new books. But more than the material gifts, they offered something rarer: attention, presence, the clear message that these children mattered, that their lives had value, that they were seen. And for children who had grown up invisible, that recognition was worth more than gold. As evening approached and it came time to depart, Thomas found himself once more at the frosted window where he had spent so many winters watching the Duke's carriage disappear. But this time he was on the other side of the glass. This time he was the one leaving while others watched. The weight of that reversal settled heavy on his shoulders. "It is hard to leave them," Julian said quietly, coming to stand beside him. "Knowing we return to warmth and plenty while they remain in cold and want." "Yes," Thomas agreed. "But I think that is what makes the visits meaningful. If we did not feel the weight of what we carry and what they lack, if we did not truly see them as fellow human souls deserving of dignity, then our charity would be empty. Just coins and coal without heart." Julian placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "You understand this in a way I never could, because you lived it. You know both sides of that window. That makes your compassion real, not theoretical or distant, but born of genuine shared experience." Thomas turned to look at his father. "That is why we must do more than visit once a year. We must create real change, real opportunity, not just for the children who are here now, but for all those who will come after. We must break the cycle that makes orphans invisible." Julian's expression grew thoughtful. "What do you propose?" Thomas's mind raced with possibilities that had been forming for months. A better education, real apprenticeships with respected trades, a fund to help older children establish themselves when they leave, perhaps even a system to investigate whether any of these children have living relatives who might be found and reunited. And his voice grew more passionate. We must use our position to advocate for laws that protect vulnerable children, but prevent them from being exploited or forgotten, that ensure every child, regardless of birth or circumstance, has a chance at a decent life. Julian studied his son with an expression that held wonder and regret in equal measure. "When did you become so wise?" he asked softly. "Somewhere between the cold dormitory and the warm manor," Thomas replied with a slight smile. "Somewhere between abandonment and claiming. Somewhere in that space where suffering either breaks you or remakes you into something stronger and more compassionate than you were before. I chose to be remade, and I choose to use what was done to me, both the harm and the help, to create something better for those who come after." "Then that is what we shall do," Julian said firmly. "Together, father and son. Continuing a legacy, but transforming it from duty into devotion, from obligation into genuine care." They shook hands on it, that simple gesture, sealing a pact more binding than any legal document. And as their carriages rolled away from Ashwood Orphanage, Thomas looked back one final time at the faces pressed against frosted windows. But instead of seeing his own past, he saw their future, a future he would help build, a future where no child would have to wonder if they mattered, where no one would grow up truly alone. The years that followed proved the truth of their commitment. The Ashwood Orphanage transformed from a place of bare survival into a place of genuine opportunity. New wings were built. A proper school was established. Skilled craftsmen took on apprentices from among the older boys. Young women were trained in useful professions beyond mere service. And slowly, other nobles began to notice and emulate what the Duke of Ashwood and his heir were accomplishing. Thomas himself became a voice in Parliament for the rights of vulnerable children. His speeches, drawn from personal experience and delivered with passionate conviction, moved even the most cynical lords. Laws began to change. Protections were put in place. The invisible began to be seen. But for all his public success, Thomas never forgot the private truth that had brought him to this work. He carried the silver locket always, a reminder of the two people who had loved him imperfectly, but truly, his mother, who had given him life twice over, and his father, who had found the courage to claim him despite years of fear. On the 20th anniversary of his arrival at Ashwood Manor, Thomas stood in the family chapel before his mother's tomb. He was now 36, a man in his own right with accomplishments that bore his name. Beside him stood Julian, older now and greying, but still strong in purpose and heart. And beside Thomas stood his own young son, a boy of 4 with grey Ashwood eyes and his grandmother's gentle smile. His name was Julian Edward Ashwood, named for the grandfather who had learned to be brave and the great uncle whose memory deserved honor. The child clutched his father's hand and stared with solemn wonder at the marble effigy. "Who is she?" young Julian asked. "Your grandmother," Thomas replied, lifting the boy so he could see better. "She loved you before you were born, just as she loved me. Her love was complicated and came wrapped in difficult choices, but it was real. It endured, and it brought us all here to this moment." The child reached out a small hand to touch the cold marble. "Will you tell me about her?" Thomas met his father's eyes over the boy's head, and Julian nodded with emotion thick in his throat. "Yes," Thomas promised his son, "I will tell you about her, about all of them, the people who came before, and the choices they made. Some good, some born of fear and pain, but all of them. leading to you. All of them part of the story that makes our family what it is. Broken in places, he admitted, but mended with love and time and the stubborn refusal to let past mistakes define future possibilities. Young Julian seemed satisfied with this answer. He wriggled down from his father's arms and ran ahead, his laughter echoing in the quiet chapel. The old Duke and his son stood together in comfortable silence, watching the child explore. "We did well," Julian said finally. "Despite everything, despite my failures and fears, we built something good. Thomas, something that will outlast us both." "We built it together," Thomas corrected, "and we will pass it on. Not just lands and titles and wealth, but also this, the understanding that redemption is possible, that no one is beyond claiming, that love, when finally given the chance to breathe and grow, can heal even the deepest wounds." Julian's hand found Thomas's shoulder in that familiar gesture that had become their silent language of affection. "I visited that orphanage each winter for 16 years, he said quietly, "never knowing my heir grew up there, never speaking the truth that might have changed everything. But you, Thomas, you took that silence and transformed it. You turned abandonment into advocacy, pain into purpose. You made meaning from suffering, and that," his voice broke slightly, "that is a greater legacy than any title or estate could ever be." Thomas covered his father's hand with his own. "We made it together," he repeated. "You gave me life and opportunity, even if imperfectly. I took those gifts and built upon them. But neither of us could have done it alone. That is what family means, I think. Not perfection, but partnership. Not flawless love, but faithful presence even after failure." They walked together from the chapel, following the sound of young Julian's bright laughter. Behind them, Lady Catherine's tomb remained silent and still, but somehow the air seemed lighter, as if a long-held breath had finally been released, as if forgiveness, so long withheld from both the living and the dead, had finally found its way home. Outside, snow had begun to fall, soft and silent and forgiving, covering the old scars of the land with new white possibility. And in that moment, standing in the doorway between past and future, between sorrow and joy, Thomas felt complete. He had been the forgotten orphan, the hidden heir, the abandoned son. But now he was simply Thomas, father and son, advocate and nobleman, bridge between two worlds that should never have been separated, but somehow, miraculously, had found their way back together. The story of the Duke who visited the orphanage each winter, never knowing his heir grew up there, had become the story of a father and son who learned to see each other truly, who chose honesty over comfort, who built love from the broken pieces of duty and fear, and who used their own painful history to create a better future for countless children who would come after. In the end, perhaps that is what redemption looks like. Not the erasure of past mistakes, but the transformation of them into meaning. Not the pretense that pain never happened, but the insistence that pain does not get the final word. Not perfect love, but love that persists, that endures, that claims what was lost and brings it home at last. The snow fell quietly over Ashwood Manor and the orphanage beyond, over the village and the countryside and all the places where children waited to be seen and known and claimed. And in warm rooms and cold dormitories alike, stories were told of the Duke, who had made a terrible choice 16 years past, but had spent every year since trying to make it right, of the son who had every reason for bitterness but chose grace instead, of a family broken and rebuilt, lost and found, abandoned and claimed. It was not a perfect story, but it was true, and in its truth lay a promise that no winter lasts forever, that spring always comes, that love, when finally given its chance, can bloom even in the coldest soil, that no one, no matter how forgotten or overlooked, is beyond the reach of redemption. If only someone is brave enough to claim them, if only someone loves them enough to try. Does this story of a duke's hidden heir and their journey toward reconciliation touch your heart? Subscribe now to receive more captivating Victorian romance tales delivered directly to you each week. Your subscription ensures you never miss another story of redemption, love, and transformation in the grandest houses of England. Comment below with your favorite moment from Thomas and Julian's journey. Was it the Christmas revelation, the visit to Catherine's tomb, or perhaps that powerful moment when truth finally shattered years of silence? Share your thoughts and connect with other readers who have been moved by this tale of duty transformed into devotion.